ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to take your seats, please? So, I hope you are all feeling refreshed after the coffee break. So we can start the next part of our event. As Ambassador Konings mentioned, we brought for you 5 high-level speakers from Brussels. In addition, there are experts covering Canada from EU military staff, from Crisis Management and Planning Directorate. Myself, I cover US and Canada in the geographical division. But we do have a special treat for you in a sense, because we brought for you Rear Admiral Bob Tarrant, the commander of EU Naval Force Somalia Operation Atalanta, and he's here to give you the unvarnished picture, the incisive snapshot of an operation that is ongoing and that is making a huge difference on the ground. So please join me in welcoming Rear Admiral Bob Tarrant.
I've never been described as a treat before, but that's that's a first. It's a real privilege to be here. It's a real privilege to represent the European Union from my operation, but most of all, and you'll immediately understand what I'm about to say, to front for the men and women who have been in EU Naval Force Somalia is also a great privilege. I have some command experience here. I've been commanding Atalanta for about 18 months now. And I was also experienced in the region before that, based in Bahrain as part of the maritime security. And I was the commander of a small force called CTF 150. Today's discussion, therefore, for me is, for those of us in the military, forgive me, at the operational and tactical level, not the strategic level. And I will be taking questions at the end, but I'm also in the panel that follows on maritime security. So those sort of wider issues, and there are plenty of them, we'll be covering in that session just after mine. So if we can just focus on that. Great that an operational speaker can give you good news, and I give you good news, but it is tinged with sadness. And that sadness is that we still have over 50 hostages held for over 3 years in utterly appalling conditions ashore in Somalia. And I'd like you to please just remember that as we go through this process. So I'm going to cover some of the details of how the mission started, what our mandate is, how we do that, a sort of narrative of the pirates, as it were, and then talk about the response, give you a view of the current situation, and then give you also a view to the future. Right. The position is, and this is a slide that it sort of looks in the dark. So what shall I do? Let's move on to that one. And you can see that what we have is an area of about 2,500 square miles of water. You know, Canada's a big country and probably one of the only ones that would fit neatly in here, but you can fit Europe in twice. And why is it important to us? Simply put, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Gulf of Aden, which just over here, we have 5,000 ships a month going through there, of whom about 90% are trading with the European Union. By any stretch, that's a European Union interest that we have to protect. Why is this such an issue? Because even though I look like one to some of you, I'm not a pirate, but I've yet to meet anybody who likes pirates. What does that mean? It means that piracy transcends politics. and therefore people want something done about it. It is an unacceptable form of criminal behavior. And so genuinely there is a lot of support there. What we also have is that the world is present here. Through this choke point, unlike some others, the world's trade is going backwards and forwards. So almost every country is represented and affected by what happens in this part of the world. And therefore, in a globalized society, the importance of the Bab el-Mandeb and these straits aren't going to go away. And so we need to do something about it, because piracy is a crime, and crime doesn't go away either. So this has to be dealt with. The sea, of course, legally covered by UNCLOS, is, as I've said, huge. It's very good for the good people, but it's also very good for the bad people. It's essentially ungoverned space when it gets to be this size. And that's been quite a particular problem for us. Let me just go on to, therefore, how we started this mission. And can I just draw your attention to the peak on the graph that you see on the left-hand side there. And it's that period which is about, as it's ramping up sort of exponentially, between about 2005 to 2008, that people realized we were stepping from something that was a problem to a crisis and heading towards a catastrophe. It was sort of affecting, and I use lower figures than some others, but about 7 to 12 billion euros a year was the sort of cost seen about it. And therefore, the UN got involved. There was a legal framework through UNSCR, particularly the 1838, which said that military force or force should be used to stop piracy at sea. And the EU made a council decision very rapidly after that position, and EU NAVFOR was formed. So what's intriguing to me about this is if you look at the lower other periods, you'll see that West Africa, even in 2012 and at the moment, is well below the level that we were seeing in Somalia. That level, of course, got us to a position where we had over 30 ships and 700 hostages taken at one point in 2011. So a response was needed. And in our mandate, really, we started with the need to protect the World Food Programme shipping. About a half of Somalia rely in some respect on what comes from the World Food Programme and indeed from EU programs to feed them. And the danger to that shipping, therefore, had a huge humanitarian effect, which was very much a focus for EU thinking and decision-making at that approach. And of course, you also had the Amazon shipping in resupplying the troops on there, and we needed to protect those as well. And that is a function that we have continued since 2008 until today. Then there's the position of deterring and disrupting piracy, activity, and robbery. This is the core day-to-day stuff that we do. And we do it very effectively, not just with us, but as I shall come on to, with other communities of military people and civilians as well. And we disrupt, and we do that pretty effectively. But I want you to just focus here, because it comes, and it's an important factor of what deter means. And for me, of course, this is a point where I would say the command and control mechanisms in the European Union are quite different from anywhere else that you exist in a military sense, in the fact that I am directly responsible to the Politics and Security Committee with the 28 ambassadors for the plan, performance, and achievement of what I do. And I take it to them, and I come back from them, which is entirely different to a NATO structure and entirely different to a national structure as well. Highly empowering if it's going well, rather difficult if it's not, I can tell you, because I'm reminded of the sort of Star Wars Senate each time you go in there when you have to answer questions on things that haven't gone quite so well from that point of view. Right, and we also look at a contribution to monitoring fishing, but not dealing with it. And that came out of the fact that there was a position that fishing was at the start of why Somalis turned to piracy. The answer is it may have been there at the start, but what I see now is it's not a factor in the problem itself, but it's a serious factor that could be helpful in a solution to Somali piracy. We don't do this on our own. And I think this is one of the key answers to Marjet Popovsky's point. Most of these issues these days are certainly beyond the ability of even big countries, but way beyond the ability of small and medium countries such as my own. And the result is it is an international effort, and it has to come together, and there has to be a common objective, there has to be common information and a common assessment to allow these things to happen. So we work with NATO Task Force 508, we work with the Combined Maritime Forces, CTF 151, but increasingly we're also now working with independent deployers from India, Japan, South Korea, and of course Russia. And it is interesting that also, you know, we've used and had help from other partners in there. For the first 3 to 4 months of this year, I had a Ukrainian ship under command from there, and I have Ukrainian people on my staff as well. The focus, however, of the independent deployers is very much in the Gulf of Aden, where they run convoy systems for ships of their own interest. The other parts of this were quite a lot of required innovation in the way this was coordinated. And there's the Shared Awareness and Deconfliction group called SHADE, where it brings military people together and other interested parties, such as industry, other militaries and the independent deployers, at a level below mine, so they can actually get on, talk to each other and make some choices and decisions, rather than bringing it up to a higher level where it instantly becomes slightly political. And it's from that point of view that we allow and encourage 3 or 4 times a year in Bahrain a proper discussion between those people who are involved. The other part of this that was innovative is the systems, when this started, weren't in place. And particularly the EU Naval Force team developed a system called Mercury, and through Mercury, this was allowed all seafarers access to instant information about what was going on and made the picture available to them. It's a remarkably good system. All ships join it, they just get a password, and then they're on. And they're seeing the chat between our ops room, NATO's ops room, and understanding exactly what's going on in the area around them. This was a huge innovation, not something we'd like to lose. The other part of this was that we had a system where people checked in with us. The Maritime Security Centre for the Horn of Africa, run by the EU, similar centres run one bilaterally, I think, with the UK and the Gulf, called UKMTO, and one also with the NATO Shipping Centre. People check in with us, and we actually have about 90% of vessels check in, which is a huge amount. So what it means to you is that industry are also taking this extremely seriously. But it's absolutely a multilateral approach. So this is the EU, and we have probably about somewhere usually between 19 and 23 or 4 of the member states actually represented at the HQ with me, and all tasks are deliberately sorted out through a discussion on how to man and who does which job with the member states. But we also have, depending on how it is, usually between sort of 4 and 6 people outside. And you can see Ukraine being one of those, Japan, Montenegro, and Serbia. So very important, I think, from that particular aspect. But what is also important in this particular work is liaison. I couldn't underestimate the number of people we deal with. So we deal obviously with the member states individually themselves. We deal with our partners in the military sense. I have relationships with 23 of the countries in the region directly from an operational perspective. I deal with about 7 UN agencies. I deal on top of that, of course, and most importantly, with a lot of other EU instruments as well. So there's a huge amount in this type of operation of making sure that we're all on the same page and on the same wavelength. It's a vital role that you take when you take up this position. So to put it, how did piracy events sort of start? And what you can see, this is a series of pictures of piracy positions, and the dots should see them actually moving from 2008, where they were close inshore, to the Gulf of Aden, and then to its height, they were in 2010, 2011, moving almost across to the Indian subcontinent. And then when we started succeeding, you can see them retiring back again. But what it also does is it reflects the changing tactics that the pirates used when they came under pressure. It also reflected that we were here for the long term. This indicates the commitment of the European Union to sorting this problem out. And I have to say, it's through this commitment that a lot of those relationships I've spoken to you about are in fact manifest, because people talk to you if you stay there for a long time. So let's just look quickly at the tactics. What used to happen was a single skiff coming off the coastline and really just almost going up to ships and taking them at will. Then after this started, you started seeing military pressure coming onto these people, so they changed their tactics so they could move further away. And what we got in phase 1 there, which is the second one down, they started taking on motherships, and they continued to use dhows so that gave them greater range off the coast. And then they would do larger pirate action groups, swapping from dhow to dhow, and being up to 1,400 miles, away from where they started. So actually, you can't say to these people that they didn't have an extremely brave sense of what's going on, because only a third of pirates got back. It was a huge penalty people were paying in lives in this process. And now, once we've put the pressure on and industry have reduced their vulnerabilities, what you're seeing here is that we're back to single dhows, single skiffs, and now just doing probing and evading. So our pressure has forced them back into a different way of operating. And part of that pressure was a thing called the disruption of pirate logistic dumps. And what's intriguing here is that the rules of engagement for the European Union are stronger than any of the other military forces, and that we are entitled to apply force from the sea, from the air, onto the land, which others are not allowed to do. And we've done it once in May 12, where we took on a pirate position, very, very carefully managed so as not to have any form of collateral damage or where any chance of people being involved or being close to it, pirates or not, and disrupted this by taking out some of the skiffs and equipment that was lying around on the beach. The effect of that was essentially minor in tactical terms, but the strategic communication was, we're coming for you. We're there. We're looking at you. We're looking at you every day over the beach, and now we're going to start doing things about it. So that impunity that they felt, that drove the boldness of which they operated, started to affect their resolve and push them away. And they've had to be innovative again in order to achieve this. But this wouldn't have happened without the assistance and full commitment of industry. Please view industry in these terms as one side of the coin and the military on the other side of the coin. They're reducing their vulnerabilities. They use a system called best management practice, which was produced together. And so this told them that they needed to go faster. It told them they needed to take self-defense measures. It told them about citadels where people could retreat into them. And it allowed them to operate in a way which made them less vulnerable to pirates. But what you also see here is at the bottom right, many of them, not that ship owners wanted to do this, have taken on private armed security. And one of the questions I get is, Bob, that's great, but it's actually private armed security that's made all the difference here. And the truth is, private armed security has made a difference, no question. But private armed security, I would like you to, if I use a metaphor, are like bouncers outside the disco door. What the private armed security do is keep it away from the ship in question. That still means that the bad guys are wandering around the town, able to go to the next disco, and we essentially, therefore, act much more as the policemen who come and take them off the street rather than just keep them off the ship. And that's a very significant difference. And it's a very significant difference because one of the things I have focused on hugely is getting our ability to get legal finish much clearer into the process that we operate to. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more. So our military response, we also discovered that once we divided up the area properly, once we coordinated it properly with the independent deployers and the other forces, we were able to have enough force to provide a credible presence, which meant that we could generate the information and the intelligence on the pirate action groups themselves, such that we could take them down. And we followed this process, and we continue to do so. It continues to be effective. I just draw your attention to number 3 there. And this has been both really good, I think, for the European Union, but really good for us. It wouldn't be military if it didn't have some acronyms in there. But what that means is Vessel Protection Detachment or Autonomous Vessel Protection Detachment. And what we have certainly done by our smaller member states is they give people to us who we train as teams and we put on very vulnerable ships, particularly those ones for the World Food Programme. And what that means is that we don't have to escort the ship. It sounds very simple, but in not having to escort the ship, it means that we release a frigate and all its potential to focus on catching and chasing pirates rather than on just escorting and making things less vulnerable. So it's been a huge release of up to sort of an extra 10% of frigate time, which is enormously important in this area. So we have now put in 154 pirates transferred from EU naval force to 6 states. And they have been, Kenya, Tanzania, things go, where are we? There, yeah. Things are working well with that, and I've certainly transferred somewhere of about sort of 30 or 40 since I've been in command, mostly to the Seychelles, but also there's an ongoing prosecution in Mauritius as we speak. This is, of course, another area of cooperation required. It's another good area for the European Union because it allows us to bring police and ourselves together to deal with evidence gathering, to understand how to create a case from people who are normally operating in a military standpoint, so that evidence is, particularly in these instances, our problems come in evidence continuity. Because if you don't have the helicopter taking the picture of the guy and there's a sort of 50-minute break, well, could you be assured it was the same skiff? Was it a different one? How are you going to make that case in court? So we've had to learn a lot of the ways of, under good advice, with good relationships that we have, and I now have a liaison officer inside Interpol in Lyon, able to sort of take this forward, because it's very important. If I'm not going to talk like a policeman, but you know, if you have a crime, it requires a motive. They've got that. They still haven't got any money, so that's what they want. It requires an opportunity. The 5,000 ships are still there because they're there. But it requires a permissive environment. And it's permissive if you are unable to, you can disrupt them, but that then leaves them to go on and do other things back again. And so we've got to break that cycle. And part of the deterrence factor has been our success, and again, publicising our success back into Somalia. So that is a graphic description of where we've got to. Of course, 2014, we're only sort of halfway through, but they're still attacking. So you're probably looking at that going, there's savings there, there's efficiency. We can not pay for this anymore. And the truth is, the message I've got to you is you've got to pay for this now. We have got to keep the pressure on. And the reason we have to keep the pressure on is we are dealing with the symptoms at sea. The real problem lies on land, and all the things I've told you about have dealt so far with the symptoms. Though we now have the Somali federal government, who we have a good relationship with, actually in the remote areas of Somalia, where we have the pirate sort of groups, and I'll come on to those briefly, you'll see that those pirate groups are still able to operate when they want to, when they have investors. And so what I'm going to show you here is the current situation there. And I'd like to just draw your attention to the photo on the bottom left. This was taken in November last year. And if we are in no doubt that piracy, people are not skulking around doing piracy. There are about 100 or so people on the beach there helping the pirates who had been disrupted by the federal German ship Niedersachsen, rushing back onto the beach themselves. They were only a couple of miles off when he first connected with them. But what's interesting is the whole community came out to get their kit, get their positions, get their boats off the sea and onto the beach, and get their all the people away, because they wanted to protect, presumably, their investment. But it indicates that there is very little alternative lifestyle at the moment available to it. So this is going to be a long job to change the causes of piracy ashore. But it also indicates that they have the capability and the will to continue piracy because its returns are so huge. I'd just draw your attention to this position, which again, a little bit there, but between September 11 and September 2013. If you can see in 2013, the red tracks are all tracks now with private armed security. And what you'll see now is that they're moving closer back towards Somalia. In 2011, though there was fewer shipping with private armed security, what you can see is the density of shipping close to Somalia was less. So people are already making their choices to reduce their levels of vulnerability because what their mistake is deterrence, which means inactivity on both sides, for success, because what I'm saying is our very good knowledge is there will be a resurgence of piracy if we're not there, or if industry doesn't hold on to its vulnerabilities. This is the last pirate action group by the French ship Sirocco, and this was taken, she had attacked a Greek ship off the coast of just between Yemen and Oman, and they were using this dhow as a mothership, and they were stopped immediately and then taken down to the Seychelles, where we organised a legal transfer, and they're being prosecuted as we speak. So very much it continues to go on. What was intriguing here is the dhow is also privately operating illegally by sort of UN mandate, and it is in effect smuggling charcoal from Africa across to the Gulf. So my message is the pirate model is fractured but not broken. And part of that is because the main groups are still there, and it's a big place, and there isn't the unity and stability in Somalia to stop them being effective. One of them, Afweyn there, Afweyn, as I understand it, means big mouth, was arrested in Belgium last year, but all the other 7 kingpins still remain, and we need to put a lot more pressure on the law enforcement part of the system to move that away. These parts of up in Puntland by the Horn itself, and here in Galmudug and the southern part of Puntland are very, very remote places. And it's here that you find out, why the effect of Somalia having a coastline that's 3,300 kilometers, the longest coastline in Africa. So for me, this is the area where we need to push on and try to get a change to remove the kingpins. Why? Because that will stop the investment. The pirates view this as a business. And now that piracy is becoming problematic, they are shifting into the Western Indian Ocean with a nexus of a whole lot of other nasty things going on. So here you have illegal fishing, narcotics, for which I know that Canadian ships have been very successful in stopping narcotic trafficking in that region, organized crime. And so what you have is, don't view them as pirates. They're organized criminals who turn to piracy because it's a good investment. But they also turn to all these other issues. And we see the tragedy of human smuggling, particularly from Somalia to Yemen, on an almost daily basis. The weapon smuggling, of course, that fuels Al-Shabaab and terrorism. It doesn't mean that piracy is connected to Al-Shabaab. That's not the point I'm making. It means that these people are very flexible in using their networks for whatever they feel that they can get a return on. But we do this as part of the comprehensive approach, which I know that Margaret Popovsky mentioned, and it's extremely important to register. And so with the other EU instruments, particularly controlled by the Special Envoy to Somalia, they deal with state building, and we fit into this. It works very well at my level. But it's all about making compromises. It's all about saying, I won't do this, I'll come and help you to do that. And it's about the same for this. It takes a lot of trust to be comprehensive. Otherwise, you can find yourself in a position where you are taking the risk, either financially or so forth, with your mission, and others are not doing the same thing. So what people have worked out here is that we are a very close-knit bunch of people in Somalia from the EU, and we work very closely together and know each other well. It's an essential part of it. But what we do is we support them in terms of logistics and in terms of providing expertise and training, but also, hosting key leadership events. And this was quite important for us in terms of looking at the way ahead. We took the president on board the flagship when I was in Mogadishu, and we had a discussion about the sea and how the sea could help Somalia both in its unity and for us in defeating piracy. And I'm pleased to say that made him reconsider the position of the New Deal, and there is a clause in there that deals with maritime security, which is most important for this country when you look at the resources available to it, both in terms of fishing and the potential resources in oil and gas under the sea. So in that position, we can now go forward, I think, as the European Union, and I have a sister mission called EU Cap Nesta, which is a civilian mission, which is now beginning to provide capability training for Somalis in Somalia, which would have been sort of unheard of 3 years ago. So it's a very significant event. That doesn't make it easier, doesn't make it a more permissive place to operate, but it's the way we've chosen to move ahead. And so I'd thank you and leave you with the following thoughts, if I may. We've dealt with the symptoms. Piracy still continues. It is a reversible situation. Unless we maintain the pressure at the moment, it will come back. Secondly, the problem lies ashore. We've got to turn our activity to dealing with that. And we've got to understand, I think, the wider context of maritime security, which is a useful entree to the next panel session, in terms of all the other aspects of security that are being used nefariously at sea in this region. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think so. We were going to take some questions now, but looking at the timing, if we run straight into the next session, I'm very happy to take any questions with that.
Thank you very much, Admiral. If I call you a special treat again, I will probably be thrown to the mercy of pirates, so I will not do so. But yes, Admiral will be participating in a second in this upcoming session, which is moderated by David Perry, Senior Defense Analyst from the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. And I just realized that we both have something in common. We're alumni of Carleton University, and if my colleagues from University of Ottawa forgive me for this product placement, Carleton is a superb university. Please.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm sure the university will be very happy to get the plug. As I welcome the panelists up to the podium here today, pay a little bit of attention to the time because I realize that we collectively stand between you and lunch. So we'll do our best to get moving promptly. Admiral Tarrant, who you just heard from, will give a few minutes to collect himself and bat third in the lineup, as it were. And we'll start with Lieutenant General Wolfgang Vossel. Lieutenant General Wolfgang, whose name I'm not pronouncing well, and followed by Rear Admiral David Gardam. Lieutenant General, if you would start us off, please.
Good morning. Thank you for your introduction. And allow me to take up where Admiral Bob has just left. As a practitioner, as one of our operation commanders, and I will try now to show you the larger comprehensive picture, how the EU as such, as a whole, is to act in the broader context of maritime security. Allow me to start with, as this is the first seminar of this kind here, to say a very few words about ourselves. It's unfolding before you, and I immediately jump in who we are, the military dimension of the EU. This is the organigram of the European Union military staff. This is the military analysis instrument. It is the instrument for strategic military planning, and it is the instrument for coordination of capability development and formulating military capability requirements. In the strategic planning part, we delivered, to give one example, the initial bit to start off with the operation, and then again we deliver what is needed to go to strategic reviews of these operations. All this in a spirit of comprehensiveness. It is a staff of 28 member states. I have officers from 28 member states. I have all services, which gives me a broad array of expertise, also in the maritime sector. Let me now go directly to maritime security. And why does maritime security matter so much for the European Union? Some of the aspects linked to maritime security were already mentioned during the earlier discussions. The importance of the maritime link between Europe and the North American continent, and Canada in particular here. 90% of the European Union's trade goes by sea. Even 40% of our internal trade is transported by sea. We are the 5th fishing community in the world, and we are the world's 3rd largest importer. I think this gives a rough picture why maritime security imports to us. And it means to create a safe and secure environment in the maritime domain, commanded by the principle of a rules-based good governance at sea. This is our starting line. And UNCLOS, which was mentioned, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is one of these baselines of our work on maritime security. We approach maritime security through a comprehensive approach, using all our instruments, through cooperation, and through a cross-sector approach, also in member states, which is certainly a challenge. What does our maritime strategy, which is at this moment, as we speak, in elaboration, particularly address? It is the set of threats and risks we have to face. It is, of course, how to coordinate our efforts, how to build a narrative vis-à-vis member states to build a common maritime strategy, and how to organize our own response. And in all this, the military has a role to play in delivering expertise, in delivering 2 CSDP missions, which we explained earlier what it means. It is our missions and operations. And here we have the executive example of one of these operations. And we also delivered our own maritime security operations concept on the military side as a contribution to the larger picture of maritime security. Building on what the Admiral Bob just has said, allow me to step up to the broader picture in the Horn of Africa, which is, the Horn of Africa, certainly a very telling and illustrative example of the comprehensive approach as applied by the European Union. We have one military operation, anti-piracy. We have a military training mission, EUTM Somalia. And we have UCAP Nestor, a civilian capacity building mission. And that illustrates what was said about the twin track approach. You cannot only address piracy from the sea, you have to address it as well from land. And the additional efforts we are deploying here, training and capacity building, are exactly the expression of the twin track, sea, land. Allow me to give just a few more details about the training mission. What are we doing here? We are based in Mogadishu. That's quite recent. Before that, we conducted this training in Uganda. We trained so far roughly 4,000 soldiers of the Somali Armed Forces. We are continuing now with specialized training, company commanders, military specialists, and as a parallel, very important pillar, advising the Somali government in its security structures, particularly the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, in how to build their own security sector. So to bring these 2 pieces, training of forces and security sector, together. The other piece in the picture is UCAP Nestor. And UCAP Nestor has a threefold approach. It is about strengthening the seagoing capacities of 4 countries of the region. You can see them on the slide. It is for Somalia, and another approach on land to strengthen the rule of law, to reach exactly what the Admiral has described, to break impunity, to bring pirates through the entire chain of jurisdiction. That's why we built rule of law inside Somalia. And of course, in the broader sense, to strengthen the legal framework of anti-piracy in the entire region. So far, Horn of Africa example how the European Union is addressing comprehensive approach, particularly if you take into account that these activities are embedded in the larger context of development assistance, political dialogue, are embedded in a regional strategy we delivered in 2011, in the installation of a special envoy for the region. All these are elements to bring together our common action here. We remain on the African continent, but we changed places for several thousand kilometers in an area which is very different in nature, but as you know well, poses severe threats and risks to the shipping industry, to the rule of law in general, to the region. And it's not only the Gulf of Guinea, it is also the broader Sahel region which is affected by the less of control in some places. We, again, as the European Union, built a strategy, a regional strategy, most recently in March. And we are well aware that the nature of piracy, to focus on this aspect, is very much different from what we have in the Horn of Africa. It's a different type of piracy. Nevertheless, there are lessons which can be taken and transferred from what we have in the Horn of Africa towards the Gulf of Guinea. We try, again, embedded in our broader approach encompassing development, the political dialogue, and all the strengths of our inventory, 4 particular aspects: helping individual states of the region to build their own security sector or to strengthen it, to strengthen the dialogue amongst the states of the region, to underpin economic prosperity as one basis for stability in individual states of the region, and of course also to the extent possible, create a common picture of the threat and risk which are posed by organized crime in the region. And of course, this is a long-haul approach and needs a long series of international partnerships, which is one of our principles of action. Just before concluding, let me very briefly sidestep to the Pacific area and to Asia. Here, of course, the EU strategy is not established in the same way. What we apply to the risks, which you are well aware of, climate change, population development, claims of territorial nature, maritime nature, all this in an area where there is no real overarching structure to bring all the stakeholders around one table, which we have in and around Europe, for instance. So our approach is built on political dialogue, cooperation in crisis management and capability building, and of course, again, development assistance. Let me just take the political dialogue. The building blocks, and to give just some examples, are, for instance, the Shangri-La process you are well aware of. It is the EU ministerials in the ASEAN context. It is the Asian Regional Forum, which for this year we are co-chairing as the EU together with Myanmar. And there is, of course, also mill-to-mill high-level defense dialogues in some places going on. So this is the inventory we act on. To conclude, I would like you to retain 3 strands, which are general for the EU and which also apply to maritime strategy and security. That is comprehensiveness, that is our inventory, which contains, and that's the topic of today's seminar, CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy, with a particular tool of operations and missions. And as a third element, military in the EU play a role in this, in planning, in conducting, and in developing common or coordinated capabilities. Thank you.
Very much. Rather than pose individual questions, I think we'll take our next speaker and then save some for the end. Admiral Gardam.
Good morning, everyone. So the advantage of being the third speaker is much of what I might have said, I now won't. So I've jotted down some notes, and I looked at the bios and who's attending the conference. So it's a very international flavored audience. So I think what I'd like to do is focus on Canada's maritime strategy, starting with Canada itself, moving out, and then build that framework on the west side of Canada, and then move to the east side, which of course is NATO and EU. So Canada is a maritime nation. We go coast to coast to coast. We have a very large coastline, and in order to ensure our security, and this, I think, is a common theme throughout all of our topics, it's all about information sharing. So when we look to the EU, when we look to our partners of Five Eyes, when we look to NATO, it's about how do we get information to queue so we can prevent incidents before they happen, ideally, or at least be prepared if an event does occur. Canada is clearly interested in the Arctic. The one thing I will say to this audience is the Northwest Passage is a country lane. The real passage is a northern sea route, that is the Autobahn. So I think to put that in context, the Northwest Passage, not well charted, very dangerous for navigation, poor visibility, and for mariners, bergy bits and growlers abound. So it's not the panacea. That being said, Canada is building Arctic offshore patrol ships. First keel will be laid next year to operate in that environment as in support of our security partners. We see non-militarization of the Arctic as key. When I look broader to North America, it's the war on drugs. That war on drugs is clearly coming through the Caribbean Basin. So we work with Joint Interagency Task Force South, of which we are a significant player on countering the drug flow coming into North America, and also encountering some of that drug flow that goes to the EU. On a broader perspective, if I look to Canada and I look to NATO, we see North America as your Western Front. So the NORAD security arrangement that we have provides the queuing, the information exchange, and the warning on events that may occur on your western side. There are three words I would like to use when I talk about Canada and how we view our security, in particular maritime security policy. The first is security. Second word is peace. The third word is prosperity. That's not just prosperity for Canada, it's global prosperity. Many of the issues that have been discussed today about Somalia, capacity building, we realize, this community realizes that, as Bob had said, we're going after a symptom, but the real problem exists much deeper. So we have to look at how we can build a network to provide that prosperity. So let's talk a little bit about China. So Canada, we have a burgeoning trade relationship with China, which by the year 2045, 2050-ish, is on the point of surpassing our relationship with the United States. So clearly, Canada is engaged on a maritime perspective in the south and east China Sea. Anytime we have ships going through there, they will go through the 9-dash line to make a point that these are international waters. Now when I look to Europe, the first thing I would say is Canada is a land of immigrants. Our ties to Europe are strong, deep, and enduring. So I think that's a given. So what does that mean when it comes to how we deal with NATO, how do we deal with the EU, and how do we deal with all those pressures I've mentioned, given that Canada has a very large coastline, we have a modest-sized Navy, but it's a modest-sized Navy that's being fully recapitalized. So we have the Arctic Offshore Patrol ships. Through the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy, they're the first to come off. The Joint Support ships second, and then third is the Canadian Surface Combatant, which will replace the modernized Halifax-class frigates. But again, defense spending dollars are shared. We have to be careful that every dollar we spend counts, which means when we look to the east, when we look to the west, we want to make sure everything we do is complementary, it is non-competitive, and we use existing systems when appropriate. So when we look to the EU, we look to the EU first and foremost, and it's been said many times today, for that comprehensive approach. The EU has an ability to do something that NATO cannot. NATO is a military alliance. The EU has a security framework which enables partners to discuss information and, more importantly, pass it and share it, where NATO does not necessarily enjoy that same freedom. The other thing we will look for is that anything we do is burden sharing. So burden sharing clearly came out in the Admiral Mullen had indicated the requirement for burden sharing. That's what we're doing in Jayada South. That's also what we're doing in places such as CTF 150. So when I kind of look to the future, what do I see? What I see is, first of all, we need to be all interconnected. We need to be able to share our information seamlessly. And most importantly, we're not competitors. We leverage the strengths we have, and with all of our dwindling defense dollars, we need to make sure that every single dollar counts and builds towards that collective security framework. Canada has and will remain an extremely strong member of the alliance. I think everyone in the room is aware of Canada's reaction to the events that happened in Crimea, where we've sent F-18s to Romania. On Monday morning at 10:30, Canadian paratroopers jumped in with Americans into Poland as a clear example of reassurance. And we're retasking one of our frigates out of 150 into a NATO framework. So why are we doing that? The alliance matters. So everything we do will always be tied back to our interests. And our interests are rooted in Europe, and they're also moving now towards the Asia Pacific. One last word, if you looked at Canada's demographics, you would see a huge European influx in central Canada and eastern Canada, New Scotland, Nova Scotia. In fact, I think they're more Gaelic than the Scots are. And if I looked on the West Coast, our second language spoken is Cantonese. Thank you.
Admiral, did you want to offer any additional thoughts? Not at this stage. Okay. Let me just offer a couple of comments that I think bear on this panel discussion. And I think this is really an opportune time to be having this discussion and dialogue for three big reasons. The first, as we all know, the move towards a comprehensive trade agreement, I think, is highly significant. In this country, we've been spending an increasing amount of attention focusing on the link between defense and trade, and particularly maritime security and defense of the global sea commons in support of our international trade. I think it was at the centenary for the Royal Canadian Navy that the Prime Minister very forcefully stated that the Canadian economy floats on salt water, and I think we can all hope that increasingly that's going to be floating back and forth between Canada and Europe. And secondly, this discussion happens at a time where the country's in the middle of resetting our own defense policy and defense strategy. And recent events in Eastern Europe, I think, put a bit of hesitation towards those that may have otherwise been suggesting that, for instance, Canada follow the United States in pivoting towards Asia. I think the events over the last several weeks put up a bit of caution about the notion that you can make these kinds of strategic readjustments without consequences. And then the last aspect, I think that this is apt, is that currently we're essentially at a low point in terms of our own naval fleet availability because of a bunch of different factors, including what had been a previous delay in our recapitalization program, but also the upgrade that's currently underway to our existing ships. So right now we're about to just begin over the next year emerging from a low point of availability, and we're actually going to be able to engage, I think, to a greater extent in the world at sea. And then the last component would be in terms of defense austerity in Canada and the degree to which our defense dollars are dwindling. I mean, I think on my read that this is actually the last year that those dollars are going to dwindle, and after this year we're going to see some progressive budgetary growth after the end of this fiscal year. I don't think we're ever going to come anywhere close to hitting the 2% target personally, but I think certainly things are looking more positive as time goes on. But I do think the notion of complementarity is certainly one that needs bearing in mind. We've certainly seen that in terms of our change towards a readjustment of the Canadian approach towards NATO Europe, looking for efforts where both we're making a contribution, but we can also receive something tangible in return. So on that note, I want to pose a question to the panel in terms of particularly linking the ideas about the comprehensive approach and information sharing. So in Canada and even in the North American context, we still have a lot of difficulty actually achieving the type of information sharing necessary to have comprehensive, or what we would have previously called whole of government operations. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect on what the kind of key challenges are in bridging between EU operations as well as with potential partners, including NATO or individual nations on a bilateral basis.
Shall I go first?
You can start first.
Good.
There are 2 or 3 parts to this. The first part is having common equipment on which you can rely, and goes the pace that the operation needs to go at, but also goes the pace the partners can go at. And not everybody can be at the same pace. And so you've got to plan in a relatively smart way in order to make that happen. The next one is a cultural shift from, and this is slightly more controversial point given what's going on in Eastern Europe and the boundary at the moment. In security, as opposed to defense, we have a responsibility to share information, not a need-to-know responsibility to hide information. Because these ideas of security are ones that affect us all and benefit us all. And if we're going to be complementary, which I think the EU position is, then our position is to try to share as much information as often as possible. The third point about information sharing is common assessment. If people take a view that though provided with the same information, they come up with an extraordinary analysis, then that is a serious problem. And this is where, from an internal EU dynamic, an op commander like me is given a lot of help by a presentation to the Military Committee and to the Politics and Security Committee, because everything is ironed out, and any differences between states and your own position are made very clear for you, so that you go ahead with a strengthened, confident mandate, even if it wasn't quite the mandate you expected. It is, you can operate with confidence right up to those boundaries. The other part of this is, we're not just operating these days with traditional partners. Our partners are from all sorts of different places. And so there is a capacity, an education, a training aspect. that really requires, and the word I would use is a relationship, and through that relationship, building meaningful trust, such that if you didn't give them the information, they realize you weren't trying to hide it or use it for a different way. So in a security sense, the op commander has to be very visible to all the actors playing around. And of course, I think we're very strongly helped in the European Union that we command headquarters which have, up to 28 member states in them at all times. And so we're in that space already. And so it's not a great step to allow it to move on.
So I think I'll just pile on from that, but I'm going to take a different tact. I'll give a Canadian perspective. In Canada, militarily, with Five Eyes, with NATO partners, we share information extremely well. This isn't about military information. This is about the comprehensive approach in a security environment, which means we're probably not going to be the lead agency in 99.99% of these events. We may be in a we'll most likely be in a supporting role. Many of the agencies in Canada are legally bound not to share certain pieces of information. So how do you get around that? There's first a test you have to ask yourself. Is this an impending threat? And if the answer is yes to that, do you want to prosecute or do you want to stop the event? So you then have to answer the question to that. Is it prosecution? If it's prosecution, information needs to be shared on a need-to-know basis. Now I'm talking about Canada, a need-to-know basis to cause an event to be disrupted so that it can be prosecuted. However, if it's an event that is clear and present danger that must be disrupted immediately, then you open the gate, you share the information, and you sort out the prosecution if you can or cannot later. There's not a single person that I think would accept, well, we didn't share that information because legally we thought we were constrained in how we would manage this event post-analysis. So we set up maritime security operations centers in Canada, East and West, which are doing that on a relationship basis. Because it has to be relationship until we can sort out, is there a legal framework which will mandate information sharing, or do we, to the best means possible, exploit our terms of reference and work within the 90 to 95% solution, which gives you enough information to go, aha, I need more, and then you take a cluster of people and then you sort out how we're going to deal with the lead agency after that. It's a challenge, and the one thing I would say is we absolutely need to crack this nut. Thanks.
General?
Yeah, allow me to address two aspects of your question, which is sharing situational awareness, and the second is how to bring comprehensive actors or actors in the comprehensive approach together. Starting with situational awareness, the complexity of the situations we have described makes it absolutely necessary to share at a very early stage and where necessary to a high degree of granularity of information. This is a challenge. For me, as the military part inside EU, I have to call on member states to bring their share of information to the fold. We aggregate this information. But the question is much broader. We have to build our own European Union toolbox, which to a large extent and an increasing extent is also relying on our delegations, for instance. This is not intelligence proper. This is situational awareness, which is broader, which is comprehensive. We have all the actors inside delegations in the different strands of potential action, development, political dialogue, economy. And all these pieces of information matter to create a common picture. And the same holds true for what I'm going to address now. It's how to bring the actors together. It is inside the EU not completed. We are in a process of development based on what we call the Lisbon Treaty. It was mentioned today. And the EAS is the centerpiece of bringing all these strands of the comprehensive approach to act together in a coordinated way. But there are other actors outside. We have the UN. I just had an interview about OSCE. There are regional actors, in Africa in particular. There is NATO. So we have permanent liaison arrangements with NATO. We have permanent liaison arrangements with the UN. And we have to find the right mechanisms with all the others to bring this flow of information together in a timely manner. You can imagine this is not easy. This asks for workforce and for good coordination. So these are really the challenges we have ahead. And when we go to a specific area, and I take an example which is very recent and high on the lines of the media these days. That's what happened in Nigeria. And I say that because it has no EU CSDP context. We are not intending to act. There is no plan. But if a nation says, I want to help here in that specific situation, it can only say that when it can build on a broad picture of situational awareness, of shared situational awareness. If not, you are running into mistakes in acting in such a situation. But that's just one example. The comprehensive approach, of course, is much broader and takes into account many more strands. Thank you.
With that, I'd like to open it up to the audience to continue the discussion. Move to the podium. Not all at once. No. Yes.
Thank you very much. João Sabito Costa from the Portuguese Embassy, and I'll raise a very concrete question. We heard about this situation in the Gulf of Guinea, that these problems with, namely also the traffic and the narcotics that destabilize all the region, all the countries, and my country, for historical reasons, and we are very much committed in that region. And I would like to see, and I heard that there were previous talks with Canada regarding this issue, how Canada sees that region of Gulf of Guinea, and being also an Atlantic country, how much think it could be involved in that area in the maritime perspective.
Just to be clear, that was Gulf of Guinea?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
So Canada views anything that potentially is disruptive, whether it's narcotic flow or whether it's dealing with potential global terrorism. And obviously counter-piracy. Canada has a different view on counter-piracy just because of the inability to prosecute without making pirates Canadian citizens. So that, but when it comes to the Gulf itself, what I would say is that anything that would be destabilizing, potentially destabilizing within that region, we would view as being potentially disruptive to the overall security framework of the globe. So would I say that Canada would be actively engaged there? Not necessarily, but we'd certainly be supportive of any actions that are proceeding in that region. Canada, by our very nature, anything for us, it's all space and time. So when we look to the east, we have to cross the Atlantic to get there. When we look to the west, it's 3 times as large. So we will always favor our resources based on 3 priorities. First and foremost, Canada first. Secondly, North America. Thirdly, anything else we can fit in that bag. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Who else? Please.
Hi, I'm Anne Fitzgerald, and I'm a visiting professor at the moment here in Canada. I'd like to ask the panel their thoughts on the extent to which you feel maritime security is influencing the wider security sector reform agenda. I could give you many examples of where I reach a bump in the wall on SSR issues, particularly in Africa, where maritime security is very fundamentally important, but because we are so groomed with our SSR checklist, which starts with the land forces, the police, and in the very best of poor relatives, the justice sector, we don't ever reach the maritime actors. And in West Africa at the moment, particularly in Sierra Leone and Guinea, there's no economic exclusion zones mapped out around these countries. There's no legislation governing any of the maritime security efforts. The legislation that does exist is never ratified in Parliament because Parliament is too weak and doesn't meet. And papers are not written because there's no functioning outer offices. So what happens is the ships come in, organized crime leaders, and the fishermen are so disillusioned in these waters that they become subject to payoffs by these big boats and ships, and a whole logistical network gets set up on land. So that undermines completely what the efforts are trying to achieve on land as well. And yet I feel that it hasn't even entered the fray of the SSR debate. So your comments would be welcomed. Thank you.
Shall I start off? Yeah. That's a great question. I would start by answering it this way. The first point is the definition of security, which isn't just about warships arriving and doing its business. It's about operating safely at sea, then it's about operating professionally at sea, and in those particular part, it's about governance of what those do, and then if there's a particular problem, it's about having military forces to deal with those issues. And in the countries you've mentioned, and in a number of other countries that we deal with, certainly from the European Union, what we see is the capacity, the will is often there, but the capacity to introduce the governance and the frameworks that are required, the infrastructure of maritime security is not available to you. And it's in those areas that you therefore create the ungoverned space that forces a position that we find ourselves in the Western Indian Ocean. I think the issue here is there aren't normative structures that are used to dealing with this. There's no great tradition of using the sea, although it has been used in Africa over many generations. And the result is that it is, to me, something that Africa, particularly when I look at that, is beginning to deal with. We're seeing that the AU has its own maritime strategy beginning to be put in place. We see that when we're talking about the Gulf of Guinea, ECOWAS has been very useful in providing guidance. And there is from a meeting that happened last year between the regional countries, the Yaoundé sort of, a bit like the Djibouti Code of Conduct is being created. But those don't answer your question in the time frame that the problem is existing. And so therefore you have this balance between deciding whether you actually need for national interest to take action yourself, or whether you need to allow development to happen. But in some countries, I think it would be true to say that the capacity is there if the will and the focus and prioritization was there as well. So I think what I would say is that one of the best ways to get maritime security going is not necessarily a local solution for people who don't have that capacity, but certainly trying to start a regional solution to the problem. And I think all of that takes time. And certainly it takes, as General Wolfgang mentioned, I think as people become more engaged in the Gulf of Guinea, which is going to become a more strategic area for reasons that probably exist in Eastern Europe, it will be applied, but it requires the will, political will, of the local states to drive it forward. Thanks.
I don't think I would add too much to what Bob had said. So we've tried capacity building in various areas. Some have worked, some have not. Clearly we did capacity building to try and establish a coast guard off the Yemeni coast. I'm not saying that that's a success or not, but that was an attempt. It is very much a long-term game. None of this is a short-term fix, because the problems are so deep and ingrained, and there's no framework to build it to, that you almost have to start at square one. So I think it comes down to what are your priorities, and I say your, I mean the West. How do we view this? How do we rack and stack each region based on the risks that we face within that region? But I have to agree with Bob. This is a, how do you get, because you can have one country that fixes its coastline, but that's like putting a Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound, because on every other area where you can have ingress or egress of illegal activities, if you haven't built a framework there, you've achieved nothing. So it's like the boy with his finger in the dike, but there's a massive hole over here. So it's going to take a comprehensive approach. It's also going to take years to build, but it's also something that I think needs to be in our conscious as we move forward. So it doesn't answer your question other than we know. Thank you.
Thank you. Not very much to add, except mentioning again, UCUB Nestor is one example in the Horn of Africa related to the region, and particularly to Somalia, in partly responding to your question. That's exactly what they are focusing at, to highlight the maritime coastal aspect of the security sector reform. I couldn't underline more what was said about the flow of illegal activities. It comes from sea to land, so we need both. We need to include both factors. And that's what we're going to try also in the Gulf of Guinea, building on the experience, which is still fresh, we take from Somalia. And it is about building security sector, maritime aspects inside individual states of the region, but also the mechanisms between these states to exchange. That's the challenge we have ahead, and we just started the dialogues. What we already aware of is increasing awareness in the region. They acknowledge to a large extent the need of doing more in this sector. Back to Somalia, the additional challenge there, of course, is the tension between the federal government, Mogadishu, and the region, Somaliland, Puntland, and Galmudug in particular. So we have to take into account these tensions as well.
Please.
I think there's another thing as well, and General Wolfgang pointed out that we in the EU are developing a maritime security strategy. When something as big as the EU decides to develop a maritime security strategy, it puts focus onto it where there was no focus before. So in a sense, that is providing leadership to a community of people who are operating at sea to realize that it is very important. So when people come to talk to us about any issue, our response will have some form of maritime flavor in it usually now from the European Union. And I think that changes the dynamic of relationships and discussions. It'll take time, but I think it also shows an element of leadership in this one that perhaps didn't exist before.
Yes, at the back.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Solomon Azombi, the High Commissioner for Cameroon. I appreciate the presentations and the interest shown in maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. Admiral Bob just mentioned the maritime security meeting that took place in my own country, Yaoundé. And I want to follow up a bit on what my colleague from Portugal said concerning that region. If at present the EU-Canadian interest is principally eastward towards China, I think we shouldn't forget the geostrategic interest on the Atlantic seaboard with an emerging Africa of 1 billion people and a strong market there, and of course Brazil and the Latin American. I think it would be proper, and I think the panelists have all alluded to that, but we would like to see a stronger interest in the Atlantic, what is happening in the Atlantic. I know Canada especially has the challenge of looking east, west, and north, the Pacific, Atlantic, and the Arctic, but I think they're very good at doing that. Thank you.
I'll start off this time so Bob gets a break. It's a really good point, and I don't want to certainly leave anyone here to think that the Gulf of Guinea is not important, because it absolutely is. It's vital ground in many ways, and the work that the EU is doing, I think, is absolutely vital to creating that framework. From a Canadian perspective, we will always look at having to prioritize our very modest resources. But one thing that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about information sharing, this is a classic example where certainly this is a security framework discussion piece, this is a comprehensive framework discussion piece, and this is a absolutely, the important piece here is to get not just intelligence, it's far more than that, it's a situational awareness and understanding of the area in which we're working. And I think that's something collectively, that's in Canada's interest, because if things don't go well in certain parts of the world, it can immediately transfer back to North America. So what I would kind of propose is that the information sharing, the situational awareness, and a common understanding of how to attack this problem are probably the three things that we first need to do so that when we do use those resources, they're targeted in an appropriate way.
Well, let me just add one aspect from the EU perspective. Stability, good governance, control of illegal flows in the Gulf of Guinea has also an impact on the region north of it, which is the Sahel, and then we come to the Mediterranean. So there is a context, that's what I wanted to underline. So there's an additional strategic interest also for the EU to enter in a dialogue with the countries of the region in order to get together better control of illegal flows in the area.
I had the opportunity to address the foreign ministers on maritime security aspects at the EU Africa Summit that was recently held. And it also perhaps goes back to that question where, firstly, you've got to bring visibility onto a place that has not had any visibility before. And then after that, through the relationships that already exist, I think one could move quite quickly to working together in the way General Wolfgang suggested, this mixture of security, prosperity, relationships and governance that need to come together to make places less insecure. I think I would just add that in so doing, we don't want to duplicate the way the sea is used in lots of different ways. We want to stick to the rule of law as our main principle and use UNCLOS and so forth. So we're not making up whole heaps of new rules all around the place to do it. There's a lot of existing legislation. There's a lot of existing legal frameworks that we want to fall back on as we make those type of advances.
Question to Paul Chapin.
Just to end on a positive note here, in light of the Russian aggression against Crimea, the measures that the Russian Navy took against the Ukrainian Navy, the threat of use of Russian force against Ukraine proper, the deteriorating security situation of EU and NATO countries in and around Russia, particularly the ones that border on the Black Sea. What is the nature of EU, NATO, Canada, US cooperation in maritime security in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea?
Who would like to take the first crack?
Okay, I will. So I would say that, first of all, that was the Baltic or Black, you said? Both. Okay, so the reassurance measures that have been put in place and are being put in place very much are being championed by SACEUR. In fact, SACEUR, General Breedlove, I had lunch with him 2 days ago, and he was here having a discussion about how those measures may unfold. What I would say is that from a NATO perspective, NATO has been put into an acceleration mode when it comes to understanding the space in which they're working, the planning they actually have to undertake to ensure that the reassurance measures that are actually taken will mean something. So as I'm sure some of the audience are aware, there are some bilateral issues right now happening in the Black Sea. There's a U.S. Destroyer currently deployed there. There are other ships considering to going through the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea. This all needs to be harnessed so as not to escalate, but to show reassurance. So what I would say is we're absolutely looking at it, but everything is done from a deliberate planning perspective, not urgent. This is not urgent planning. We need to understand what communications we are trying to deliver and also the effects that we're trying to achieve. So you will see something come out. This is very much in the vein of SACEUR's to-do list. I will say that Canada has, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, chopped a frigate to move to within that region, and we're sorting out employment now. But this needs to be coordinated, reassurance, clearly through the lens of NATO.
Two aspects related to the Black Sea area from our perspective. The first is continue our cooperation with Ukraine. Admiral Bob described that. It was successful. Of course, they're in a difficult situation now as far as their resources and their means is concerned, but we are willing and prepared to continue and even strengthen that cooperation. The second aspect, which reaches to a large extent into NATO, which came up during a recent ministers' meeting also on the EU side, is the port security around the Black Sea area, expressed very clearly by the concerned EU plus NATO member states there. There is an aspect which has to be taken into account by NATO. It has to flow into our maritime security strategy, and wherever we, with the means of the European Union, can support these member states in this specific aspect, legal means, for instance, we will do that.
I think with those responses, I'll have you all join me in thanking the panel, and then we'll turn it over with 3.5 minutes to spare to lunch.
So I invite you for lunch. It's also taking place over on this side of the of our premises. We all need food for thought in a literal and metaphorical sense, and this is a literal sense of the term. So enjoy it. And we have 1 hour, so please come back within an hour. Thank you.